Today we'll be looking at a case from the very end of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. Before Florence, the daughter of the affluent James Tout from Byron Center, New York, came into the world on the 7th of January 1876, her father, a prosperous businessman, departed it. He had in fact died 6 months earlier, on the 7th of January. Yet in a foresighted move, he set in motion a considerable trust fund for his yet-to-be-born child. This sizable inheritance was to be given to his child upon their marriage, and Mr. Tout had arranged that it would be carefully administered by a trusted friend and banker, and by the time Florence had entered her teenage years, it had grown into a substantial sum. Florence became the focus of Howard Behnam, a travel agent with lofty ambitions. He specialised in selling trips to the public and offered them instalment plans as a means to pay. He began to court Florence, and the young lady seemed fascinated by the smooth-talking 23-year-old. Although this unfolding romance cast a shadow of disapproval and disappointment upon Mary Ann Farrant, Florence's mother, and her stepfather, Mr. Peter Farrant. They did not trust the young gentleman's intentions. However, they feared that their objection to the relationship could result in the young and impressionable Florence to run off with Mr. Howard Behnam. Their worries were eased when, on the night of the 3rd of August 1892, the young lady alleviated their fears by assuring them that she had no intentions of fleeing. The following day, she told her mother that she was going to visit a dental practice in the small city of Batavia. Mary Ann, seemingly unconcerned, waved goodbye to her daughter, but Florence did not go to the dentist. Instead, she embarked on a journey to Rochester to rendezvous with Mr. Howard Behnam. There, in the private office of Justice White, the clandestine lovers exchanged vows, sealing their union in marriage. The newlywed couple then invested in a residence nestled within an upscale district in Batavia, which reflected a semblance of affluence and social standing. Howard assumed control over the administration of Florence's inheritance, venturing into the realms of private banking and money lending. At first, things were good between them, and on the 7th of December 1894, Florence gave birth to a baby boy, who the couple named Howard after his father. However, despite the apparent domestic bliss portrayed by their purchase of a home and the arrival of a child, the passage of 5 years unveiled a disheartening truth to onlookers. The marriage was marred by unhappiness. Mr. Howard Behnam's mistreatment of his wife became evident, and whispers of his indulgence in a rapid and dissolute lifestyle outside the bounds of matrimony were discreetly talked about by those who knew him. Florence, once a vibrant presence, was perceived by many to be a mere echo of her former self, burdened by the indiscretions of her husband and the demands of motherhood. Her effervescent youthful glow had been eclipsed by the aura of defeats, leaving behind a young woman marked by the hardships and challenges that life had presented. In the early hours of Monday, the 4th of January 1897, at her home at 38 Ellicott Avenue, Florence Behnam died. She had been ill for a short period, but the news of her passing still came as an unexpected shock to those who knew her. Initially, the death was attributed to rheumatism of the heart, a cause that elicited no more than routine comments and sympathy for the grieving family. However, a subtle shift occurred as whispers began to circulate, insinuating that Florence's death might not have followed a natural course. The origin of these rumours remained elusive, and many dismissed them as baseless speculation. Yet against the backdrop of uncertainty, these murmurs gained momentum, so much so that the undercurrent of suspicion eventually led the coroner to speak to the grieving widower, Mr. Howard Behnam, about performing an autopsy on his deceased wife. Recognising the profound seriousness of the circumstances and driven by a steadfast desire to absolve himself from the shadow of speculation and gossip, the gentleman openly agreed. This was deemed crucial, not to provide clarity to the lingering mystery, but also to establish a transparent understanding that would dispel any unfounded rumours and cast a spotlight of truth behind the tragic event that had unfolded. The jury selected for the inquest was made up of men from a very high social standing. Their first task was go to 38 Ellicott Avenue and view the deceased. The autopsy was carried out by Dr. Showerman and Dr. Townsend, and the brain, liver, heart, stomach and intestines were meticulously extracted for further scrutiny. Their intention was to dispatch these organs to Buffalo to verify if her passing was attributed to any factors beyond natural causes. However, on completion of the autopsy, both the performing physicians and the overseeing doctors unanimously agreed that her death bore no signs of foul play. Consequently, the planned dispatch of body parts for chemical analysis in Buffalo was deemed unnecessary, as a conclusion reaffirmed the absence of any suspicious circumstances surrounding Miss Behnam's untimely end. The inquest was adjourned, so the funeral of Mrs. Florence Behnam could take place the following day, Thursday the 7th of January. Despite the statement from the doctors stating that she had undoubtedly died from a disease of the heart, her family and friends were still not entirely satisfied. They continued to approach Coroner Barringer, who faced persistent requests to extend his investigation, as doubts still lingered about the true nature of Mrs. Behnam's passing. The next day, the coroner informed the jury that the inquest would recommence on Tuesday the 12th of January, but he declined to divulge any additional information. This withholding of details stirred a renewed bout of rumours and speculation, creating a resurgence of discussion and conjecture amongst the residents of Batavia. Samuel J. Elliott, a man employed locally at E.M. Jewell Pharmacy, relayed a conversation that he had had with Mr. Howard Behnam. According to Mr. Elliott, approximately a year ago, he came across a Canadian newspaper article which detailed a case where a husband had allegedly poisoned his wife using prussic acid, which is also known as hydrogen cyanide. This substance is known for its rapid passage through the body without leaving a trace. Mr. Elliott recalled that Mr. Behnam expressed keen interest in the story, even taking the newspaper from him to read it personally. Following this, Mr. Behnam questioned Mr. Elliott about the effects of the substance. Notably, Mr. Elliott added that at first he didn't give much consideration to the matter. However, he proceeded to share an unusual incident that occurred a week before Mrs. Behnam's passing. During this time, Mr. Elliott made 2 separate sales, each of an ounce of hydrogen cyanide, to Mr. Howard Behnam, with only a few days between the transactions. In the first sale, Mr. Behnam explained that he needed the potent poison to address an issue with a troublesome dog. Although initially hesitant, Mr. Elliott agreed to the sale, but once the substance was given to Mr. Behnam, he then insisted that the purchase should be confidential and told Mr. Elliott not to inform the store owner. Mr. Elliott then told of how a few days later, Mr. Behnam returned and asked for another ounce of hydrogen cyanide. Mr. Elliott said that he then inquired if the dog trouble had not been resolved, but Mr. Behnam dismissively stated that he needed it regardless. Mr. Elliott claimed that he refused to sell the hydrogen cyanide, and this resulted in a heated argument. But fearing a potential physical altercation, he reluctantly agreed to the second sale. Another pharmacy staff member, named Frank Clark, was present during the conversation and could validate Mr. Elliott's accounts. Both pharmacy employees revealed that they had been following the news reports regarding Mrs. Florence Behnam's demise and were not completely convinced by the autopsy's findings. Subsequently, they shared their interactions with Mr. Behnam with the pharmacy owner, who instructed them to inform the authorities. On receiving this new information, Coroner Barringer instructed that Mrs. Behnam's grave be guarded throughout the night. At 4:20 a.m. the following morning, police officers McCulley and Griffiths apprehended Mr. Howard Behnam at his father's residence on East Main Street. He was brought before Justice Denham, formally charged with the murder of his wife, Mrs. Florence Behnam, and then transported to the Genesee County Jail. Coroner Barringer issued an order for the exhumation of Florence Behnam's body, initiating a second autopsy, which was conducted in the residence of the deceased's mother and stepfather. The initially extracted organs, along with additional ones, were securely sealed and dispatched to Dr. Frank P. Vanderberg who was a chemist working in Buffalo. The examination of all the organs was anticipated to require a considerable amount of time. Simultaneously, within the local community, discussions revolved around little else but the death of Mrs. Behnam. Opinions appeared to be divided on her husband's potential involvement in her demise. Despite the results of the chemical analysis of the organs not yet being available, the inquest continued. Dr. Morris W. Townsend, who had participated in both autopsies, said that the initial examination had been conducted hastily. He added that he had to visit his sick grandson and had spent the previous day in Washington. He told the inquest that he was not aware that there was a specific focus on detecting poison. However, following the second autopsy, he noted signs suggesting that the death might not have occurred naturally. He said, "I am not inclined to believe that the death resulted from natural causes." He then stated that evidence had emerged during the autopsies, indicating that death could have been caused by hydrogen cyanide. During Mrs. Behnam's short period of illness, she was attended by Dr. Tozier. He told the inquest that when he was first asked to call on her, he believed that she was suffering from a bilious attack, and at no time did he consider her condition to be serious. In fact, when he was asked to visit the patient again on the 3rd of January, he considered her condition to be somewhat improved, so it was a great shock that she passed just a few hours later. Dr. Tozier recounted an incident when he witnessed Mr. Behnam extracting powder from his pocket, intending to administer it to his wife. Inquiring about the substance, Dr. Tozier was informed by Mr. Behnam that his wife had obtained morphine and appeared to have developed a dependency on it. Dr. Tozier said that he told Mr. Behnam to watch his wife closely, as she could not continue to take the substance. As the inquest continued, supposed findings from the chemist in Buffalo circulated, but these reports were nothing more than rumours. Despite their speculative nature, each instance sparked considerable sensation in Batavia. Some very important testimony emerged towards the conclusion of the hearing, when Mrs. Mary Ann Farrant, Florence's mother, took the stand. Present at her daughter's residence at the night of Florence's death, Mrs. Farrant told how she was awoken by her grandson and then heard noises coming from her daughter's room. She said that she went to see if Florence needed anything, to which Florence said that she did not. It was 1 o'clock in the morning on Monday the 4th of January. Mrs. Farrant said that Mr. Behnam was also there, so she returned to her room. However, she heard her daughter say, "I do not see what you want me to take it for." She then heard Mr. Behnam mutter some words, before hearing her daughter say, "I don't care, Howard. I think you are just as mean as you can be." The investigation endured for over a month. By mid-February, reports surfaced again, indicating that Dr. Vandenberg had detected minute traces of hydrogen cyanide in Mrs. Behnam's organs. However, the specific organs harbouring this substance were not disclosed. The district attorney said that he would make no further comment on the matter and wait until the trial. When the inquest ended, Mr. Howard C. Behnam faced an indictment in Genesee County for the heinous crime of first-degree murder. The charge alleged that on the 4th of January 1897, in Batavia, New York, he deliberately and with premeditation administered a lethal dose of hydrogen cyanide, commonly known as prussic acid, to his wife Florence Behnam. This calculated act was intended to cause her death, and indeed is from which she died. The trial of Howard Behnam began on the 30th of July 1897 and took much the same course as the inquest. It seemed that public opinion as to his guilt was again divided. Many questioned whether Mr. Behnam had administered the poisonous substance to his wife, and if she had actually died from this. Some stated that the only evidence against Mr. Behnam was that 2 doctors who had previously certified that the death of Mrs. Florence Behnam was due to natural causes had later altered their stance after the emergence of the hydrogen cyanide theory. Additionally, a chemist claimed to have discovered minimal traces of the poison, which was the only thing that formed the basis for the prosecution's case. When the trial began, it courted great interest from the public. but as it progressed, it seemed as though interest had waned, and that people were now only interested in the verdict. Expert witnesses presented their perspectives on the methods employed to detect hydrogen cyanide in the deceased lady's body. The defence's medical witnesses argued that the autopsies conducted were incomplete and suggested that Mrs. Behnam's death could have stemmed from various causes other than poisoning. The defence acknowledged that Mr. Behnam had purchased hydrogen cyanide, but asserted that this purpose was to address a medical condition affecting him, while conceding that the defendant's life had not been an exemplary one, and recognising that his questionable actions had significantly swayed public sentiment. They urged the jury to consider these factors impartially in their deliberations. The jury were eventually sent out to deliberate on Wednesday the 22nd of July, and they returned 22 hours later to announce that they found the defendant, Mr. Howard C. Behnam, guilty of murder in the first degree, and the judge sentenced him to death. Mr. Behnam's legal team pursued a fresh trial, contending that the entirety of the evidence against him was circumstantial. They argued that if the trial had occurred outside the county, a more favourable outcome would have been likely, given the widespread notoriety of the case by the time it reached courts. Unfortunately for Mr. Behnam, despite 2 months of consideration, the request was denied, and the date for his execution was fixed for the 13th of November. No plea for clemency reached Governor Roosevelt. However, in a surprising turn of events, just days before Howard Behnam was scheduled for execution, his attorney filed for a retrial, citing the emergence of new evidence. In early February 1900, 3 years after the death of Mrs. Florence Behnam, her husband was granted another day in court. The trial commenced, with Mr. Behnam being represented by Arthur C. Wade, a distinguished defence barrister. While much of the evidence echoed that of the first trial, Mr. Wade meticulously scrutinised it. When doctors Townsend, Tozier, Showerman and Prince delved into the autopsy discussion, their testimony that had been so crucial in the initial trial was skillfully dismantled. Even Dr. Vandenberg, who had analysed Mrs. Behnam's organs, conceded that he had discovered no traces of hydrogen cyanide in the deceased lady's stomach. A new witness, named Eva Harris, testified that shortly before Christmas in 1896, she visited Howard C. Behnam's residence and discovered Mrs. Behnam dressed but lying in her bed. According to Miss Harris, Mrs. Behnam seemed visibly distressed, crying and sobbing even after Mrs. Harris had entered the room. Miss Harris told the courts that Mrs. Behnam said that Mr. Behnam had been unfaithful to her. Mrs. Harris mentioned that she tried to comfort the distressed young lady, assuring her that things would improve over time. However, Mrs. Behnam then revealed that her husband had contracted a disease and transmitted it to her. She was using a medicine provided by Mr. Behnam, but it failed to improve her condition. Miss Harris went on to say that she advised Mrs. Behnam to seek medical help, but Mrs. Behnam felt too ashamed to do so. Miss Harris added that she kept this conversation confidential until October 1899, when she shared it with the defendant's mother. When the trial ended, Mr. Howard Behnam was found not guilty. Howard Curtis Behnam was now a free man, but fortune did not favour him, as a year later, on the 14th of July 1901, in the city of Columbus, Ohio, he succumbed to illness in a hospital, a victim of both brain and typhoid fever. He was 30 years old. The son of Howard and Florence Behnam was raised by his maternal grandmother, Mrs. Mary Ann Farrant, and her husband, Mr. Peter Farrant. He later changed his name from Behnam to Farrant and died in 1977 at the age of 82. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.